Wow, there's a lot of people here. Cool. As I said, I'm Bruce Wang. I actually lead a team called Games Platform now at Netflix. If you didn't know, Netflix has games. As Mary mentioned, as a two-time startup founder, I joined Netflix about 4.5 years ago. This morning, so I'm on vacation with my family. So once I'm done with this, I can go on official vacation. My daughter said to me, "Good luck, Daddy, don't mess up." So it's like, thank you so much. All right, so if you're gonna take away anything from this talk, right? I know a lot of talks, there's a lot of stuff going on. Just remember this one statement. Tech debt is a natural byproduct of the software innovation cycle. That's it. Because what you wanna think about is if you know that it's natural byproduct, how does it reframe your thinking of how you deal with it, right? I think this is a natural problem that we all can do so much better as industry. All right, origin story. Am I Gi Hung or the other guy? I can't remember. But so I want to kind of talk through a little about where this concept came from. If you're like, I've never heard of tech debt as innovation, that's because I made it up. And I've been trying to figure out how to talk about it. And I'll give you kind of the original. So this is the chart we have to show how complicated your architecture is. And so at the bottom is when I joined Netflix, I led the team called API Systems. And so I would say 15 years, 5 generations of APIs. It's 2024, so it's now 16 years, right? Super complicated, some of the oldest tech at Netflix. Then, as part of reorg, as Lena said, we love reorgs. So as a part of reorg, I inherited a team called Product Data Systems. And you might notice it's 10 years old, but we also own one of the oldest streaming technologies at Netflix, what we call NCCP, or Netflix Content Control Protocol. So this really gave me the basis of like, how do we think about this debt that we have, this really big challenge of legacy systems and newer systems, and how do we balance, right? At one point in API, leading API, we basically ran 3 API stacks at the same time in production, right? And how do you really think about that problem? And then there were a few aha moments that really kind of set it apart for me and really crystallized this concept of tech debt as innovation. So the first one is, tech debt has a marketing problem, right? And how this started was, I was at a dinner with 3 of our most senior engineers, principal engineers, or E7s. We don't have, just recently had levels at Netflix. And I remember talking to them, and they were saying, you know, we manage debt, we manage this complicated ecosystem of technologies, but no one appreciates it. And I'm staring at them, I'm like, aren't you all E7s? Like, what do you mean no one appreciates? It's like, well, no one cares about that. It's because I can ship product. And I was like, I don't think so. I actually think it's because you're so good at managing these different technologies is why you're such a senior engineer. And I thought, there's a marketing problem here. We're not talking about tech debt in the same way that we talk about innovation, right? Second problem, and this came from our VP of Engineering and Consumer, Sharon and Tom, who's our E7, and they said, tech debt is a suitcase term. So if you haven't heard the concept of the suitcase term, it's basically the monster under the bed. It's what you blame everything on, right? It's like, oh, it's tech debt. This is tech debt. That's tech debt. And it's like you're not being specific enough about what this thing is, right? And that's part of the problem, is if you label everything as tech debt, how do you solve it, right? The last, it's gonna be hard to hear. We gotta be honest. We are not helping each other, okay? Did product tell you to adapt Golang and go on a 3-year migration? Did product tell you to adopt Vue.js for your slicer UI? No, right? I think the point is we have to really think about what are we creating that, and I'll talk about a little later, but like what are the systems that we're advocating for that actually becoming debt? So what do we do, right? How do we change? And I'm gonna go over kind of the 3 big things we did to sort of solve this problem. So first, tech debt principles and definitions, right? That's the first thing we did, was creating a shared vocabulary for all of us. Remember I said it's a suitcase term. So how do we define it? What are the definitions and what are the principles we should follow, right? And I'm sorry, I'm going to put a bunch of text. I normally don't, but that's how it is. So in the memo, we wrote, tech debt is the delta between a system's current and ideal state. And here's kind of the things that aren't tech debt, right? Bad code, normal bugs and software errors, right? And here's the best one. This is my favorite. Inherited code and systems and tools. Just because you didn't write it doesn't make it tech debt, all right? And I hear some of you laughing because you probably have some of those systems. Either you wrote it or you inherited it, right? And so this is kind of like that kind of basis of how do we really start talking about tech debt in a more productive way. The second, and here's the definitions and principles, and I'm not going to go too much in detail. It's already a lot of text. But I want to call out knowledge debt as a key problem we just mentioned earlier, right? When you have a lot of systems that you don't own, you don't know how it works. And if you think about Netflix being a 27-year-old company, there's a lot of systems that maybe there's one or two people that actually know how it works, right? And then the principles is sort of what we're going to talk about, or what I'm talking about right now. Be specific, right? That's the vocabulary. What are we actually talking about here? What kind of debt are we dealing with, right? And how do we manage it? And then there's also like making it visible, right? Which is me getting up in front of all of you to talk about it, right? Is that we need to talk about it more openly and talk about it in a more productive way, right? And then be proactive is that there's a lot you can do, actually. Don't resign yourself to say, hey, there's nothing I can do about debt. It's just, and I'm being stopped by the business. It's like, that's not true. I think you can really, if you think about it and you think about how you can deal with it, you could do so much more. So remember this, neglect is not a strategy, all right? So this is part of the be proactive piece, pragmatic action over neglect, right? And so the idea is that, I mentioned NCCP. I had to research how old it was because the people who built it aren't here anymore. And it's 17 years old because I looked at a slide deck that said it was one of the original phase 1 edge architectures for Netflix. And in 2019, the team that ended up owning it, which was Product Data Systems, made a very important choice, which was we're going to actually invest in NCCP and make it more modern, right? We had NCCP legacy, and we're going to make NCCP modern, right? And you think, but it's an old system. All the new stuff is not on this system. Why are we investing in this, right? And I think this is the thing, is that when you neglect it, it makes it worse, makes the debt more problematic. And the fact that we actually put in the time to make it easier to manage extended the life. Now, we're not going to get rid of the system until 2025, right? So by that point, it's going to be what, like 18 years old? It's old enough to drink at that point, right? And so you got to think about like, wow, that's a really big problem. How do you make sure you can actually manage this in a proper way, right? And we actually invested rather than just forgetting about it. All right. The second kind of big thing we did was name it and fund it, right? So we talked about, right? You need to be very specific about the debt. And when you can name it, you can fund it, right? And there's several projects that we kicked off because of this. One is device retirement, where I called it the top of the funnel problem, right? If you think about all those devices that we still manage, the TVs in the basement that you're watching, that's all legacy and old systems, right? Is how do we deal with that legacy stack is you have to address the device problem, right? And then we have other initiatives as well. And so the idea is that when you name it, when you say, I'm going to fix this thing, then you can fund it, right? When you just say, I need to address tech debt, how are you supposed to fund that, right? So be very specific, like I said, and that can help. And so I wanted to talk about a project. It's called Increased Confidence and Frequency of Deployments, right? Or ICFD. The idea is we were going to build out a healthy software hygiene culture, and we were going to enable centralized fleet-wide change management. So one of the interesting things about Netflix, you might have heard about our culture, freedom, responsibility, we have so much autonomy. But the issue when you have a lot of autonomy is we can't even agree on like which bug tracking software we want to use, right? What's our deployment strategy? What systems you want? Yeah, we might all use Java, but the frequency and how we deploy is really different between teams, right? And so the idea is, how do we actually do fleet-wide changes? You're talking about massive, massive systems that need to deploy, right? And so this is where we talk about, when you think about tech debt as innovation, what do we have? One of the most senior engineers is driving this project, right? And so you have to have someone who's really strong and able to corral a lot of people. Second, Netflix tech-wide impact, right? People say, oh, tech debt, it's that thing that you give. No, this is like Netflix-wide. How do we deploy massive amount of systems really quickly, rebake and redeploy really fast? We have 20 plus ICs, and these are the track leads, right? Multiple tracks, virtual teams, and the PME team. So something I might not have mentioned is we have a team called Platform Modernization Engineering, right? And we said, hey, you name it and fund it. So we actually fund a team that's job is to do migrations, right? It's modernization effort, right? This is actually a pretty big team whose job is to make migrations smoother. And they've been helping this project quite a bit, but it also involves many, many other systems, because we're talking about rebaking and redeploying the entire Netflix fleet, right? Surfacing debt blockers. Guess what the number one problem was? When you try to increase confidence in deployments, the number one issue people bring up is, I don't know what the system does. I own it, but I'm not sure what it does. So I don't really deploy it, right? And that's an issue, is that you don't know what this thing does, then you're gonna be afraid to deploy it. And remember I said earlier that you really need to spend that time and invest it and figure out, document it, what does this thing do, and how does more than one person own it? And last is, innovation is actually required. So this whole talk is about, how do you drive innovation when you think about tech debt? And innovation is required. We are innovating on something called confidence shrimp. If you don't know, we have Chaos Monkey, Chaos Gorilla, and Chaos Kong. This is where Netflix turns off machines, regions, and entire zones, and then regions, right? So Chaos Kong is we evacuate all of US East. Be like, it's down, right? So that's something we pioneered called chaos engineering. And now we're talking about confidence chimp, which is, can we deploy super fast at any time, right? And then we're gonna start taking those tech debt principles and definitions, specific definitions, and start marking our services and be able to say, hey, this has knowledge debt, this has extensibility debt. And so we need to be able to innovate so we know what are the challenging systems that we can deploy. The third thing is talk about it, which is this, right? But it's also celebrating it and learning from the struggles, right? We have a lot of complicated systems. And what was fascinating is I ended up seeing this pattern across all these different systems. So, I led the API systems team, and we were on a 7+ year. I say 7+ year because, it's unclear exactly when we started, but 7+ year API migration. The moment we finished that migration, we went on another API migration, right? And so we learned a lot from that. And then I started seeing a pattern, right? And so here's what I call the migration trap, is you have your whatever VX is your workhorse, the thing that does everything, right? And you have this life cycle where it gets into the improve and maintain stage, right? And then someone has an idea. Oh, this is hard to maintain. Let's go build V+1. It will solve all the problems, right? I'm not even going to try to pronounce Ergelenden Vachelan. What Lena said earlier about the system will do everything. It will solve all the problems, right? And the problem is you're going to have to migrate off of the old system. And that's what people don't take into account, right? The migration tax and how long it's going to take is much longer than you think. And really, it's this race against time, right? You're going to be trying to migrate, and you can build a prototype. That's not the problem. You can even land a few of your initial customers. But when you start trying to migrate the technology, you really run into a lot of the problems, right? And here's why. You will have leadership change, right? We talked about orgs. You will have team changes, right? People move around, right? You'll have business and priority changes. You think about Netflix, COVID changed for us, just as mentioned earlier. and then the competition came in and changed our priorities, and now we're doing games and live and ads and everything, right? A lot of our different priorities that we thought we were doing when we started the API completely changed. Technology's changed. We talked about AI, right? We got to put AI somewhere, right? And we're not going to do that. Not on the API, at least. And so technology's changed. You know, when we created our graph language called Falcor, GraphQL did not exist or had just started at Facebook, and it wasn't the technology we had access to, right? And it doesn't work. That's the other thing. What if it just didn't work? What if this newfangled technology you picked just doesn't work? And how do you pivot that? Does anyone know what this chart is? Raise your hands. Can you guess? No? This is a chart of Figma and InVision usage, right? And so if you look at the timestamp, public launch of Figma was September 2016. V6, which is their workhorse, right, started migration to V7 in 2015. Here's the problem. By the time they launched it 4 years later, that's where it crossed. It was too late. And so this is why I'm showing you being able to deploy technologies and do it really well is actually a critical imperative change. And that's what something Renee said earlier, right? How do you actually deal as a technologist with the business, work together? All right, so why call it innovation, right? It's a really weird term. Tech debt is innovation. That's kind of an odd phrase. When I first talked about it in front of the company, you know, the PR person's like, I don't understand what this means. Like, why did you call it this thing? And really, it's about being an innovation vehicle, right? The better management and better innovation and vice versa helps the business, right? So what we're talking about is when you innovate on the debt, you open up possibilities for the product. And product innovates, it opens up debt cleanup and debt innovation, right? So you think about increased confidence, it's really a debt project. We don't call it tech debt. We talk about increased confidence in our deploys. And so it's an innovative project for a platform, but it's really allowing to address the tons and tons of knowledge that's in our system, right? And so I want to bust some memes because tech debt gets a lot of bad rap or is misunderstood, and I don't want you quoting me to your boss about, oh, I heard this person say something about tech debt, we should do all these things. So first thing, legacy is debt. That's not true, okay? Just because you have an old system doesn't automatically make it debt, okay? It could be very valuable, and it could be a tool you use effectively, right? So one of the things I did when I ran the product platform systems team was create a team called Technology Lifecycle Innovation to house some of the most tricky debt areas so we can properly pay down that debt and properly deprecate and delete the systems. Second, debt zero as a goal. That is definitely not the goal, okay? Just like in real life, you go buy a house, you need to borrow money, right? And just like in software, you're not trying to get to debt zero. Your goal isn't to actually, if you get to debt zero, that's kind of a problem, right? And so you have to think about, how do I better manage it? When is it prohibiting me from doing something in the business, right? So it's really about being more thoughtful about dealing with this problem, right? This is my most hated thing. Debt is for junior folks or for onboarding, right? I'm a senior engineer. I'm a principal. I don't deal with that. Oh, yeah, you do. You might be creating it. That's probably why. And so, yeah, you laugh. Wow. That's scary. No, just kidding. No, and that's the thing, right? We have this weird notion of, hey, debt is this side problem that we have that we don't have to worry about, right? I want to innovate. I want to build new stuff. And we talked about we need to change the way we think about our industry. How do we innovate in an era of shrinking and decline, right, in the tech industry? And we have to think about it in a different way. And I hope I showed a little bit earlier that it takes some of our most senior engineers to actually address our most complicated debt problems. Won't happen on a greenfield project. This is great. I took over the games platform team, right? Games is new. If you didn't know games was a thing, it is a thing. Go download it on mobile and on TV and web. And it's like, oh, you going? People joke. He's like, Bruce was championing debt, and he got sick of it and just went to a new project. right? And so the idea is, oh, you're going to a new project. You don't even have to worry about it. Like, I think, dude, that's like where all the debt is created, right? 90% of the debt was we're trying to ship games first, and we had to make it work, right? In 2021 is when we built games out, and we weren't sure if it was going to be a thing, right? And so we had to create and slap a bunch of stuff together to make games work, and we have a whole life cycle we manage for game developers, right? That's also a different persona for us. Game developers or third parties is not something that Netflix typically does. So what we did is took the Partner Connect, which is what we use for TVs, and slapped a games thing on it, right? Lots of debt. It's not built, right? Guess what? We built our data systems all on SVOD. Games launch is totally different than content launch, right? So there's a lot of hacking to be done to make a video look like a game. That's a true story, okay? It's all video objects underneath. And this is a little bit of, we got to look ourselves in the eye. Yeah, it won't happen in this other tech. When we adopt this new language or this new thing, we won't have debt. It'll solve all our problems. And it's just not true. You'll just have different kinds of debt. You might solve the existing debt you have, but you will create new one, right? And so that's something to think about. All right, and then the last, of course, what this whole talk is about is there's nothing we could do, right? And that's also not true. Is if you think critically about how you would deal with this debt, like you would with an innovation project. How would you innovate on? How would you test it? What would you do, right? I think there's a lot we can do as an industry. So I think the question is like, well, you're Netflix, but what can we do, right? And I want to think about this problem sort of across multiple stages, right, of a startup. I've been a 2-time startup founder, and I've created a lot of debt myself. And so when you're founding, it's just to survive. Create as much debt as you need, right? Do not worry about it, right? And now you want to clean it up. We had to switch languages. We built our startup in Java, and then we switched to Python, and eventually Ruby on Rails. And so we had to shift. But you're just trying to survive as a startup, right? So don't try to attempt some utopia debt management strategy. When you get to product market fit, you need to start automating, right? So if you think about lean startup, a lot of startups grow, and when they're first growing, they're dealing with a lot of manual processes, right? And this is where your debt comes from. Some of the debt where you're managing these things in a very manual way is how do you start automating? And then you think about when you start getting to scale. And this is one of the most critical things, is when you start scaling, there's always this trade-off question. Do I do debt or do I do new thing? You have to do both. I think that's kind of the mentality you have to have, is if you want to deliver on that future, you need to be able to do both. And then when you get to steady state, this is where that innovation part comes in, is that maybe you're not as stuck as you think. And maybe working on that piece of debt or that old system will unlock something in your business. I was remembering talking to someone yesterday at dinner, and they were saying, hey, by going to multi-language, they have to really innovate on the debt systems they had, right? And then lastly, if you're a mega corp, Netflix is actually not as big as like the Facebook and Metas out there. You pick hard over easy, right? When you deal with a big project, typically what we do is like, oh, we'll pick an easy project. No, you pick the super hard project. You pick the hard project first because you need to vet that this newfangled technology is actually going to work on some of your more complicated use cases, right? So service mesh is something that we're adopting, and we obviously built like a bunch of prototypes and initial customers, but the big thing to get off the ground was to get my API team to adopt it, because we handled 50% of the egress traffic, gRPC traffic, Netflix. So if you can make API work, you can make anyone work, right? So go after the hard. And then I'm going to leave you with this last statement. You manage debt better so you can say yes to the business more. Remember what Renee said earlier? Their number one project is GitLab migration. Oh, that was music to my ears. I was like, I hope she doesn't steal my whole talk. And this is a statement that our VP of Consumer Engineering said. I love this phrase. If we manage our debt better, it's so we can say yes to the business more. Think about all the times like, oh, I can't do that thing because our system is weird. Or I can't do this other thing because it's designed in a really coupled way. And if you think about tech debt as an innovation vehicle and about tech debt as innovation, What can you do? What are the business things that you can achieve? And that's it, right on time. Thank you.